Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. And what I'll mostly be concentrating on is the fact that we, earlier this year in June, released an Antimicrobial Stewardship statement. But I'll explain first a little bit what is the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, because I'm sure some of you don't know. We're basically a multi-stakeholder initiative, by which we mean we embrace the full value chain. So we have producer members, we have processor members, we have commerce, which includes pharmaceutical industries as members. We have financial institutions, retailers, civil society. Have I missed anybody? I think that's about all of them. Academia as well, of course. Right, so what we do is, we're the global sort of overarching organization, and just for the beef industry. So we participate in FAO's Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, and we represent the beef industry within that forum. And our approach to sustainability is in that Venn diagram you can see in front of you. So we regard sustainable beef production and sustainable beef as to be the intersection between where it's socially responsible, economically viable, and environmentally sound. And we also, when we established ourselves in 2012, set off with the ideal, the vision and the mission that we would be science-based, and we would be empowering producers and the value chain to become more sustainable. We'd be based on continuous improvement, and that we'd be moving the bottom. So we're not about capturing the best producers in the world. There are lots and lots of people who already do that, who talk about how fantastic the top 5% are. But that's not making a big difference to the global impact of the beef industry. We're trying to move the bottom. It's not nearly as glamorous, but we think it has ultimately more impact. So, I'll move on to the next slide. There we go. There we are, all over the, well, not all over the world. The blue countries are where we have national initiatives, and the light blue ones are the most recently established. And since we're on this, I wonder if I've got a... Yeah, I do. Okay, just a quick quiz for you. Does anybody know what percentage of the global bovine herd is in the US? Anybody hazard a guess? Okay, I'll tell you, it's 6%. 6% of the global bovine herd is in the US. Anybody hazard a guess how much of the beef you produce? Okay, it's 20%. 60% of the cattle and bovines, because that includes buffalo, in the world are in Africa, India, and China. So basically, Africa and Asia, 60% of all the bovines in the world. How much of the global beef do you think they produce? Well, nobody's guessing anyway, so I'll tell you the answer. No, but you're not far off. 30%. So with 10 times as many bovines, they're producing 1.5 times much beef as you guys. So I think that was an interesting statistic. For the rest, it doesn't have much to do with antimicrobial, but it does, of course, because we'll come back to that in a minute. Right. So we've got companies all around the world. In all of those national roundtables, we've got about a total of 500 companies and producer organizations and everything else. And in the countries where the roundtables are active, so for example the US roundtable here in the United States, that represents about 80% of the cattle on feed through the feed associations who are involved. And it is at least 2/3 and probably more of the cattle that are actually slaughtered in terms of the processes that are involved. So it is a significant part of the beef industry in the countries where there are roundtables. Now those new countries like Mexico, Southern Africa, China, they have basically said that they formed a round table, but they're not really active yet. And then we have a couple of exceptions. Australia has called it a framework, so they didn't want civil society involved. So theirs is very much an industry framework. It includes the whole value chain, but not civil society. So there are a few different models, but basically that's the sort of the setup that we've got. So we developed 5 principles, and under those there are criteria for sustainable beef. There are a total of 32 criteria, so I didn't think I'd put those up for you. And the national groups that you saw on the previous slide, they then take those principles and criteria and they prioritize the ones that are most important in their own country. And they create indicators, metrics, and the means of verification for basically moving the beef industry in that country in a more sustainable direction. Right, finally I get to antimicrobials. Why did GRSB think that it was important to have an antimicrobial stewardship statement? Well, it's part of sustainability, clearly, because it's part of health. It's part of welfare. And when we developed our principles and criteria and we released them for public comment in 2014, the biggest single issue that we got comments on from the public was antimicrobial use. And we had somebody from the Pew Charitable Trust here. They organised very kindly for us a petition on the subject of antimicrobial use in the beef industry, which I had the pleasure of reading 6,000 signatures. So, it was clearly something that the public was very concerned about, and it was clearly something that was really an important part of sustainability. We need to be able to continue to use antimicrobials in the beef industry. It's part of what makes the beef industry in this country so efficient, but if we use them indiscriminately or irresponsibly, they're going to lose their effectiveness, and we're not going to have them anymore. So clearly, to the beef industry, it was very important that we manage them properly, and to the public, it was very important as well. So it's part of basically our social license to continue doing what we do. So there were good reasons for doing it. Our retail members, people like McDonald's, who we heard from this morning, for them it's a top priority. They're getting constant pressure on the issue, and as you heard, they are going to be making an announcement later this year probably on what they want to see happening in the beef industry with regards to antimicrobial use. We hope very much that it'll be in line with what we already published in June. I'm sure it will, largely, but we don't know exactly what's in there yet. Anyway, you can find the statement. I'm sorry that I haven't put it up on the screen big enough for you to actually read, but there are 9 main points, and for those of you familiar with things like the OIE's guidelines on responsible use, you won't find anything very startling in there. We base this on the OIE's guidance. We work with people from OIE, from FAO, and from throughout industry to develop something that we could get consensus on. So it's not stringent, but if you look at the tripartite report from OIE, WHO, and FAO, you'll realise that there are only 64 countries actually follow the tripartite recommendations to limit the use of critically important antimicrobials for growth promotion. Only 64 countries are actually doing that, and 39 of those are in high-income countries, and only 3 in Africa and 7 in the Americas have done that. So us as a global organisation thought, well, it's important to have this for the beef industry. If the countries aren't going to take the initiative, at least the beef industry within those countries can. And there are only 67 countries who have legislation in place to control all aspects of production, licensing and distribution of antimicrobials. And 56 countries in the world have no national policy or legislation regarding the quality, safety and efficacy and their use and distribution. So basically there's still a huge part of the world which has not got anything in place to ensure responsible and sustainable use of antimicrobials. That's why we thought it was relevant and important for the beef industry to say, well, at least if the country's not going to do this, we are going to do it on behalf of the beef industry. So if you look at the impact of what's happened in Europe following, Denmark, the Netherlands and countries like that, where they've significantly reduced the use, there have been a few lessons learned, and I'm not a specialist in this by any means. I'm sure there are people in the room who can tell me much more about it than I'm just about to say to you. But what we observed in the Netherlands, I happen to live in the Netherlands, is that they went for a very rapid reduction in the use of antimicrobials. They had a target that went at 20%, 50%, 70% over a period of 5 years. And those figures were fairly arbitrary, to be honest. They were just figures that said, right, we've got to reduce it. By how much are we going to do that? And then they came up with those figures and they came up with the time frame. I think the lesson learned from that was it was probably a bit too fast, because what they saw, at least in calves, and I deal with the beef industry and thus also the veal industry, they saw a 10% increase in mortality in the calves when they went through that process. So that was clearly not a very sustainable solution. If they'd have maybe allowed management systems to take account of the change in antimicrobials, they would have had less of an increase in mortality. Now, over time, they've recovered that, and it's not as high as it used to be. But it was just a lesson that, you know, going all out for a massive reduction might not have been the most sustainable option in the case of the Netherlands. But on the other hand, I think the evidence from from Europe in general is that as you reduce the amount of antimicrobials being used, and certainly those that are of critical importance to human medicine, it does have a positive impact in the long term. It may not have a positive impact for the producers, though. I mean, I think the Scandinavian producers are just having to accept that they're less efficient than they used to be as a result of the policies that have been enacted. And that is regarded, I suppose, they can rationalise that by saying, well, there's been a societal dividend. But unfortunately, it's not a dividend that gets paid to them in cash, which they'd much prefer. And they were promised before the whole process started that they would be compensated, and in the end they never were. Somehow that bit got left out of the legislation. But it has had a positive impact for human health. Okay, so this is the last slide. I'm just going to say building consensus was the hard part of this. Clearly there were going to be members within GRSB who feared change and who thought we were trying to put them out of business or something like that. We went through several attempts to get this off the ground. We had a number of illustrious chairs of our antimicrobial working group who stepped up and then later stepped down and said no, they were not comfortable doing it anymore. And I feel that there were people within the industry who were definitely putting pressure on some of those people. So it wasn't an easy road to go down. But when it got to the final analysis, when I talked directly to some of those industry sectors who were most reluctant to engage in this process, their fears had become inflated in their own mind. And when we talked about, well, what is it the OIE does? What are we already doing in the countries where you're working most? And they weren't that far away from what we ultimately came up with. And it was just a question of biting the bullet and saying, okay, no, if that's what you mean, then we can accept it. And there are two specific examples that I wanted to talk about. And those are the use of macrolides. And obviously macrolides in North America are used quite extensively in the beef industry, both for bovine respiratory disease and for liver abscesses. And there was a huge fear that we were going to come out with something that was going to make it very difficult for the beef industry to use macrolides. I said, well, that's not in our interest. Our members are all in the beef industry. And clearly, while we want to see alternatives being developed and refine, reduce and replace where possible, we do understand the need to use what is feasible and what we can actually get a health benefit from. So our wording it may look like a bit of a fudge, but we had to use the wording we did. So we talk about having a tiered approach to use of antimicrobials. We talk about using effective antimicrobials that are of least importance to human medicine first in animal treatment, and only using the ones that are of higher importance to human medicine if those less important ones are not effective for the specific issue that you're trying to treat. So that was one of the issues, and the other one was, of course, feed efficiency. We've got several members in Europe, and our European members were adamant that there is no need, or in fact that it's a negative thing to use any kind of antimicrobial for feed efficiency, in other words, as a growth promoter. And we did not find our committee, which included many specialists and veterinarians, was not convinced that there's any evidence that the use of ionophores was presenting a significant risk to human health. And obviously it is also a significant economic benefit to beef producers in countries where it's allowed. So we didn't accept the European position that ionophores should not be allowed. But in terms of feed efficiency use, our statement is very clear. Ionophores are the only antimicrobial that should be used for feed efficiency purposes in cattle. And those are the two examples. Those were the two biggest sticking points for our members, and particularly our North American members. So we came to compromise. I'm not saying it's perfect, but this is a document that will continue to be refined in the future. And I think as we see things moving here in North America and in other parts of the world, we'll learn from that, and we'll be able to refine and improve our statement in the future. So I hope that's been useful, and feel free to ask questions either afterwards or in the corridors. Thanks a lot.